Excerpt from the official contact discussion on Tuesday the 29th of May 2018. Translated with deepl.com. Disclaimer. This is an unofficial translation. Figu site Zeakin 97. PDF page 1 to 10.
But now I would like to say to you again that you should say and explain a little more about what you explained during our conversation on the 28th of April with your long monologue, because I think that further remarks are really necessary.
You are probably right, because the whole thing cannot be explained enough. But I think, because you mentioned the travels in the past with Sfath to the Paleolithic, etc., where already the first form of faith arose, after which after a little more than 2 minutes the first killing or the first murder took place, as I experienced observantly, that I do not have to talk about it. Nor do I need to talk about the horrible religious human sacrifices that I made in various other epochs with various ethnic groups and clans together with Sfath, but also with Ascetic. Well, I think that would lead much too far, because the whole of what I can present and explain in another longer monologue covers a great deal, so even today there will not be enough time to list all the facts. What I would have to explain would fill several books I would have to write about it. But I'd like to add something to the whole thing, maybe. Wait. Yeah. Give me a minute, please. Well, then it would be good if I were to take a special position on the whole thing, but that will again lead to a longer, but also this time incomplete monologue, because nothing can be said completely that needs to be said and explained. Well, even if I attack or condemn the religions and sects, and thus also the religious, sectarian delusion of the believers, as well as the factors of religious contexts in the relationship, that religious delusion is based on the stupidity, influenceability and instability of the believers, this absolutely does not mean that I attack or condemn the believing people as such or the believing privileged people as people verbally or in any other way. What I have to criticize and mock is therefore, and this must be absolutely clear and understandable said, not the believing man as man, because as such he is for me a creative being and as such in every relationship of aggression and insult etc. absolutely unassailable and taboo. So I dare not, in any way whatsoever, to unbecomingly attack or inadequately insult a religious, sectarian or otherwise delusional, insane or enthusiastic person as a human being in any verbal form. Such a doing has never been and never will be my way of life. Even if I speak in my statements and explanations of the believers, mad believers, religious fritzes, believers in God, etc., who are stupid, servile and intellectually, reason and intelligently handicapped, etc. Because in each individual case this corresponds only to the usual and unusual way of speaking. If something unkind, wrong and unfair etc. is recorded and denounced with a person. But by this it must never be understood in a wrong way that man himself as such or man as man should or will be attacked, but only his false views and opinions contrary to the real reality and truth, his religious faith, his character, the impairment of his mind, his reason and intelligence, but also his impaired conscience and the deep inner malicious impulses and the wrong attitude resulting from this. All this in the context of what arises effectively when faith is suddenly forgotten and is over, when the opportunity for degeneration and violence arises, when the evil impulse is deep and underground inside break through to the outside and everything gets out of control, whereby the religious believing man, as of course often also the religious believing man, then kills, murders, massacres, rapes and does all evil in this state. The very great shamefulness of religious delusion is revealed in the fact that a person who has become uncontrolled in his faith lives in the delusion that he cultivates love, peace, freedom and justice as well as humanity and other high values, although in reality he does so only apparently, because he is effectively only trying to live them halfway outwards, while they all do not exist deep inside of him, because they're only the smoldering malicious underground impulses prevail, which come outwards on every suitable and inappropriate occasion and cause uncontrollably roaring disaster. And because the believers are so repulsed and slavishly enslaved by their faith in real reality and its truth, they are also deaf to any truth-enlightening words that denounce their faith because of its falsehood, according to which they think they have been attacked as human beings because of their delusion. So they can neither perceive nor comprehend that when they are addressed as believers of a delusion and their believing is criticized, the whole thing must never be understood as a criticism of their humanity, but is always and absolutely only related to faith in every relationship and way. It is completely irrelevant whether a person is addressed and described as a believer, delusional believer, religious obsessive, religious fanatic, religious representative, etc., because this always refers only to faith or faith and all other concepts connected with it which are addressed, but never to man as a person or as a person himself. And this fact cannot be mentioned and explained often enough, because in each case only one's ideas, thoughts, fantasy, faith, opinions, actions, deeds and behaviors can be recognized, evaluated and judged as wrong or right, respectively may be recognized or criticized as exquisite, while the human being as such or the human being as human and as person or personality is an impeccable creative being that may not be embraced as such. So in this way the religious faith rests. The delusion of man and the essence of man as such are to be understood, whereby it must also be clear that in every relationship and in every case not the essence of man itself acts, but always only his entire physical mobility as well as his mind, his reason and intelligence, which are effectively the executive factors, but not man's essence and personality. If by any occasion or circumstance, however small, evil, violent, evil, deadly and murderous acts and deeds are committed and carried out by man, not by man as such, but by his faith, view, opinion, attitude and the resulting behaviors, because religious faith and the resulting views, opinions and attitudes prevent the deep, innermost smoldering emotions that are not conscious to man from becoming conscious to him and being controlled. And because he is unaware of these underground emotions that are smoldering deep inside man and break out, such as violence, hatred, revenge and retribution, etc., which results from jealousy, lack of peace, lack of freedom, disadvantage, envy, greed, affliction, joylessness, disadvantage, psychological damage, dissatisfaction and animosity, such as aversion, revulsion, antipathy, enmity, resentment, discord, prejudice, anger and anger, etc. Is the fact of antinomy, resp. A special kind of logical contradiction that contradicts man's delusion and invalidates his faith, but also denies him the right of his alleged and externally played false and hypocritical attitude to love, peace, freedom and justice, etc. And since this has been the case since time immemorial, is still the case today and will continue to be so for a long time to come, everything has been wrong since time immemorial and since the origin of religious delusion, leading to inhuman and life-despising brutal and violent degenerations and to enormous injustice many millions of times over. Since time immemorial, religions and sects and every religious delusion that has emerged from them have produced nothing but global disaster, malicious and degenerate violence, wars, war massacres, war crimes, bloody terror, rape, destruction, organized crime and atrocities and outrages against people through state death penalty laws. And what has been brought upon humanity on earth has claimed hundreds of millions of lives over the past 15,000 years. But even today, the religions, sects and delusion and delusional fanaticism rage and demand hundreds and often thousands of lives every day, through fanatical religious hatred of other faiths, religious terrorism, religious suicide attacks and other religious killings and murders, as it will continue to do for a long time to come. And all this is because the people of the earth, at least the majority, are trapped and enslaved in religious forms of delusion which impair the minds, reason and intelligence of the believers, as well as of many believers independent of faith, and make it impossible for them to perceive, grasp and control their inner and unconsciously malicious and profound movements which lead to malignant degenerations when they break outward and cause immense disaster. All the facts I have mentioned entitle me to face every religious believer and every other person honestly and to tell him freely, openly and honestly what I find wrong in his views, opinion, his mind, his reason, his intelligence, his attitude and behavior from my real point of view. And I can do this openly and with harsh words that are apt with the truth, without attacking man as man or insulting him unseemly, improperly, unseemly and just unseemly, so I also do not make myself guilty of inconvenient inappropriateness. Of course it is the case that the people of the earth, at least the majority of mankind on earth, even academically educated people, explanation. The academic is to be understood as knowledge acquired at a university or university only theoretically and in practice. Generally see and misunderstands the real reality and its truth completely incorrect and therefore fundamentally contrary, because they think illogically or consequently contrary and consequently are neither able to perceive the effective facts as such nor to really understand them. The inevitable consequence of this is inevitably that no understanding for it is raised and evenly not thought about, if the real fact of its wrong opinions, its opinion, its faith, its bondage or enthusiasm, its understanding and its reason, intelligence, conviction and holding modes with open and clear words is brought to explain to humans. The rule is inevitably that people who are addressed and made aware of this do not accept such open, honest and real truthful, enlightening and truth-exposing disclosures. On the contrary, they equate everything well-intentioned with the enlightening words of evil attacks and grave insults, which they think they are directed against themselves as human beings and thoroughly misunderstand, because they are incapable of understanding and reason due to their ignorance, and are incapable of thinking, and equate all their behavior and movements, their views, opinions, their faith, their bondage or enthusiasm, their intellect and their reason, their intelligence and attitude with their being human beings. From this confused point of view and like-minded misunderstanding, they then feel unjustifiably attacked, become belligerent, angry and, under certain circumstances, fall into rage, hatred and enmity with regard to that person who reveals to them the true truth about all that concerns their views, opinion, their mind, their reason, intelligence, attitude and behavior. In this way, however, they fundamentally prove themselves, which they are unable to perceive and grasp in their ignorance, their insufficiency of reason, as well as their instability, uninhibited influenceability and thoughtless gullibility, through which they thoughtlessly and unconsiderately become acquainted with religious and other religious and cult recipients, bondage and ghost captors through lies, deception, fairy tales, dogmas and traditional fairy tales and fantasy stories as well as actions and deeds etc. To be duped, caught and humiliated to delusional, bondages or fanatical enthusiasts. The true fact is that the inability of people who become religious believers to think and decide for themselves, independently and clearly, causes such a malevolently humble submission of faith that good and evil are no longer questioned by those who believe delusionally. Consequently, it is automatically no longer evaluated what is right or wrong, in accordance with the law of creation or against the law of creation when things and actions occur that are ordered and demanded, for example, by religious, cult and state leaders, military, secret services, groups, communities, institutions, criminal organizations, or by any other bodies. This was particularly emphasized in relation to war, but also in relation to hatred, murder and manslaughter, assassinations, acts of revenge and retaliation against those of other faiths, foreigners and aliens of race, security forces, the innocent, indivisible population, governments or any group etc., which are to be hostile and eradicated in madness. If any leader, whether religious, sectarian, political, military or economic, etc., and their vassals order a war, a revolution, an uprising or death penalty through appropriate legislation, then the people, who are loyal to the faith, immediately howl along without hesitation and thought. And this is because the mind, reason and intelligence of the majority of every people is so minimized and impaired by stupidity that the submission to the leaders of every kind, whether religious, sectarian, political, militarist or economic form, etc., which has been set before and become their own, is reduced. Who has eaten into the flesh and blood and into the submissive believing maltreated brain that it only coughs doggishly to the leaders and whimpering absolutely believing listening, licking their butts and smelling evil around them. So it comes that all believing people, regardless of whether they are religious, secular or prisoners of leadership authority, believe or obsess and, in the aforementioned manner, impaired in their understanding, reason and intelligence, in no way defend themselves against the dictatorial machinations of those who are obsessed with leadership power without having to struggle. On the contrary, they subserviently party, submit, obey, accept everything, bow down, bend, stand upright and show strict obedience to the leadership authorities or superiors, and so on. In this way, in their faithful obedience, they then surrender completely to the hatred they have sucked in against alleged enemies and go to murderous wars against them. And they do so to indulge their religious craze for obedience, as well as for the sake of the obsession with power of their leaders, heads of state, commanders in war-raising and unpeace-making masterminds, in order to become murderous, to kill and ultimately to be massacred and to die themselves. And when people use all kinds of violence, be it torture, beatings, rape, killing and murder, then no thoughts, no feelings and no other emotions arise among the violent, because everything is completely automatic and uncontrolled due to the malicious impulses that emerge from the deepest inside. When the deep inner secret regimes of the majority of humanity on earth, as well as the religiosity of the majority of believers of all religions and sects, and the resulting real views, opinions, attitudes and modes of behavior and these believers in God are thoroughly perceived and analyzed in detail in daily life, then an extremely unpleasant truth arises. This is because it is recognized that their profoundly internal smoldering movements, as well as their external visible modes of action resulting from them, are not compatible with their ethos, which is similar in appearance to the outside world. Explicitly, in fact, their outward movements, actions and external behavior are completely contrary to their inner deep-rooted bad ways and bad values. So, in truth, in a hidden and outwardly misrepresented way, they behave in opposition to their ethos, in a false and misrepresented way in relation to their morality, their sense of duty, their loyalty to duty, morality and their sense of responsibility, On close observation it can also be perceived and established that their ethics, too, correspond to nothing more than a lousy acting, with which they deal thoughtlessly and do not worry about the completely different unkind and unworthy emotions, views, opinions, attitudes and behaviors deep within them, which in reality can smolder and at every suitable or unsuitable opportunity come to an outbreak and break through. And if this happens by some circumstance, which can be tiny as an iota or big as an enmity like jealousy, hatred, violence or war, then it is over with the majority of the people of the earth, and thus also with the majority of those who believe in religion with the ethics played outward. Consequently, they played in only pretended love, peaceableness, humanity and morality as well as the pretended valuable moral attitude, The good character and the advantageous way of thinking fraudulently played in deceit can no longer be maintained, because their subterranean inner impulses break through viciously and viciously. And what is particularly bad is that the whole majority of the earth, mankind and the majority of the religious believers in God do not know of the presence of the emotions smoldering deep within them, because on the one hand they are not instructed in this regard, on the other hand they are not concerned about themselves in this relationship and are not interested in self-knowledge. As a result, it is not possible for them to perceive and control the malignant emotions of various kinds that are smoldering deep inside of them, as a result of which they break out and break through at every opportunity, thereby completely freaking people out and viciously implementing their overwhelming anger through degenerating violence, then unrestrainedly murdering and killing their peers. No matter whether it is the part of the normal majority of humanity on earth that is not religious sectarian, but philosophical, ideological, or religiously completely unbound, or whether it is the majority of religious believers, for all of them succumb to murder and killing when the primeval, unkind and unworthy emotions, views, opinions, attitudes and behaviors deeply smoldering in them break through and they cannot exercise any control over them. And this has been the case since time immemorial, ever since mankind emerged from the natural evolution and development of planet Earth. And the fact that the whole thing has been like this in a murdering and killing manner since time immemorial, not only among the majority of people who do not believe in religion, but also among the majority of those who believe in religion and sects, can be proved by the history of humanity on Earth, especially with regard to wars and persecutions of religion, sects and believers, in which millions of people were killed and murdered. Also by state armies, which since ancient times recruited their majority of fighting forces from religious and sectarian believers, as is still the case today and will be the case in the future. Not only tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, but many millions of religious maniacs were sent into bloody wars, where they caused enormous, horrific massacres. And they have done this since time immemorial for whatever reason, whatever that may have been, whatever it may be today and whatever it may be in the future, because in them their underground inner impulses broke through hopelessly and maliciously, and for them the whole stupidly imbecilic belief in God of alleged love, peaceableness, humanity and morality, valuable moral attitude and good character as well as advantageous nature, morality, sense of duty, loyalty, sense of duty and responsibility was completely irrelevant. As a result, and still applies today and tomorrow, the only rule in any case was to kill, torture, massacre and rape as often and as much as it was at all possible in blood, murder and killing frenzy. That all this corresponds to the truth, which I know in this regard and have seen on various occasions also through journeys in the past with Sfath himself, has only ever been recognized since time immemorial by humans and thus by a minority of the entire population of the earth, and raised their word against it. But what they have achieved with it, that was absolutely nothing at all and has not been fruitful for all time, just as it has not been fruitful today. Since people also recognize the effective truth, raise their word and call upon people to think, perceive and recognize what religions and sects and the delusion of God believe really are and what they actually cause in evil and disaster. But as has been customary since time immemorial with the majority of the religious believers on earth, they immediately rise like wild monkeys on the trees and scream wildly, gesticulating and searing against every person who dares to tell the truth, admonish and point out what the real facts are. And it is usually the religious believers who effectively denigrate all those who know and warn about the truth, and see them everywhere in the public media such as newspapers, journals, radio and television, as weirdos, wise men, fantastes, sick and crazy do-gooders, sectarians and as madmen, insulting and shouting at them. All these religious mad believers are preceded by the religious cult fritzes, who, as religious masters, theologians and other representatives of the delusion of God, enchant countless unstable people with their delusions of faith and turn them into compliant delusions, believers by suggestive influence of lies and fairy tales. And the fact that this greatly impairs these believers' minds, their reason and also their intelligence, and brings them to such a low level in this respect that the whole thing degenerates into stupidity and faith is as certain as the amen at the end of a Christian sermon. And that then the absurd nonsense of immaculate conception through the Holy Spirit of God is said to have led to the birth of a Son of God, to be thoughtlessly believed by the Christian faithful, and to become a rock-solid delusion of faith, that is unavoidable. This already ancient lying, an irrational Christian fairy tale story, as it was made clear to the faithful also in various other old religious lies in a similar way, and from which Christianity has taken over the whole fairy tale burr, was not spread by the prophet, or proclaimer Emmanuel, alias Jesus Christ, who never bore this name, but was invented by some of his disciples only after his flight from the cross, when he was already on the way to India. He was accompanied by his twin brother James, his companion and disciple Mary Magdalene, who was devoted to him in a deep platonic friendship. Mary Magdalene, who truly was never his mistress, but his stepsister, who held a deep fraternal love for him, and Joseph and his first wife, who came from Magdala on Lake Galilee and died at the birth of her daughter Miriam, Mary Magdalene. Miriam, Emmanuel's mother, was also on her way to India with him, but she did not survive the strains of the journey and died and was buried in the north of Pakistan. But what can still be said refers once again to the instability of the faithful, who, through their religious delusion, thus shaped by the suggestive persuasion of the believer-catchers, who themselves fall for the mad delusion of faith, and are dogmatically humble praying mantises, just like gods, devotees, mantra, ambush their victims. And this comparison really resembles the actions of the praying mantises, who are active lurking hunters and remain motionless for hours until a victim approaches them, which they then grab and eat up with their traps. But when the soul catchers who believe in God and religion are taken as a parable, they are always on the lookout for victims who, when they fall into their clutches, drive them suggestively with religious sectarian delusion into a slavish delusion of God and then exploit them through offerings and religious taxes, etc. And this must be repeated and said another time, the believers are unfortunately no longer able to perceive the energy and power of their intellect, their reason and intelligence up to stupidity. This, as well as that everything is stopped and stalled, so that they are no longer able to think about everything independently, intellectually and rationally, and are no longer able to recognize the truth of real reality. And that, even in fear of divine punishment, they no longer dare personally to make their own decision as to whether or not they want to fall for the suggestive whispers of the dogmatizing delusional believers of God and dog-like piety, that is then only an inevitable consequence. So it comes out of faith piety, if it arises through any circumstances, that innocent people and alleged enemies are massacred in mass murders, and even genocides are carried out in the name of God and delusion without hesitation. This, while as believers, before they cause such monstrosities, they first run into the souls, or into their churches, and in their fear and cowardice pray hypocritically and beg their God for victory and blessing in a doggishly self-deprecating way. And if the whole thing is seen and judged from a clear perspective, then it can be said with a clear conscience that the religious delusion, whose actions and procedures and all its degenerations have been criminally the same since time immemorial until today, will continue to carry itself far into the future. So the religious delusionists continue to hold up a holy book in one hand, while in the other a knife or a firearm is swung and thus the throat is cut or a bullet is put in the head of the next person. And that this is indeed the case is also recognized by other people who do not let themselves be influenced by religious crap, but use their intellect, their reason and their intelligence to think and decide for themselves, uninfluenced by suggestive fairy tales of religion and belief. But unfortunately it is the case with all these people that their perceptions and insights in this regard are fruitless for mankind even when they speak out and cry out the whole catastrophe of the effects of the religious madness of faith and its enormous inhuman and criminally humane madness into the world. And this is because people who believe in God are blind and deaf to effective real reality and its truth in their stupidity, unreason and weakness of intelligence, as this newspaper clipping also says, which is precisely geared to what corresponds to my insights, experiences.
To the topic, title is Nowhere for Humanity. My committer those are always willing to fight for God, the most unpeaceful men on earth, because they believe they hear heavenly messages. Their ears are deaf to every word of humanity. From Stefan Zweig's Maria Stewart, Dieter Hepp, Mannheim Source. Mannheim, Morgan.
The fact is, in everything, that all these members of the faith, whether religious, political, military, state, philosophical or purely worldly, are unstable in terms of comprehensible self-responsibility, inner peace, inner freedom and self-determination, and therefore do not have their own healthy, righteous and justifiable opinion, but only accept and represent those who are hammered into them by the leaders or who are clicked into them by some other suggestive fellow human being. With regard to the instability of the majority of people susceptible to faith and bondage, it is demonstrable that the suggestive influences acting on them by religious believers and religious believers, and in the case of political military state bondage catchers and their believers and bondmen, quickly and uncontrollably increases the inability of the fact that the clear and effective facts with regard to the real reality and its truth can no longer be perceived and cannot be comprehended. This means that people who have fallen for a faith also live it in bondage, regardless of whether the faith and the associated bondage are of religious, political, military or state leadership form. The believer-bearers live in fear of being punished if they do not obey the rules, guidelines and regulations of their religious bondage, which are imposed on them by their religious faith or by state and military laws, and thereby force their personal decision and freedom away from them. Consequently, in religious faith as well as in state and military conduct, there is a forced and inescapable obedience to faith against which the majority of unstable humanity does not dare to resist for fear of punishment. As a result, however, religious and cult leaders of this kind can, on the one hand, in their delusion of God, provoke religious wars against those of other faiths, and incite their faithful to bloody, murderous and terrorist massacres to defend their religious mania associated with lust for power. This delusion is based on a primitive dull faith of unstable, weak people, who pathologically weakly believe in something higher and in a self-improvement, because their own inability and personal uselessness as well as their own failure to live can be pushed out of the realm of responsibility. Similar to the degenerated work of religious believers, religious leaders affected by delusion, who maliciously force their delusional believers into bloody and violent religious wars and murder and terrorist machinations. The same is also done in a similar manner by the state, secret service and military powers. Basically, it is not the peoples themselves who sow, cause and incite hatred, strife, lack of freedom and injustice in the world, but the doctrines of misconduct and nonsense of religions, sects, philosophies and diffuse worldviews, as well as the unsuitable and responsible, wordless state rulers, their advisors and other minions, lobbyists, military, secret services, psychopathic followers and inexperienced supporters from different classes of the population. State and military, the peoples are and are bound by violent and compelling laws, whether the citizens like it or not, because in this regard the free will of their own decisions and actions is usually stifled, and they also have to pay financial military dues through violent state and military coercion, in order to provide military services or military service. If war is then instigated by the state powers or the military, those doing military service are forced to go to war and murder alleged enemies by obeying orders. If they are not obeyed, they may be executed as a result of refusal to serve. However, if people resist by protesting, by committing suicides, such as public self-immolations, or if politicians are murdered, etc., this does nothing to succeed, because the rulers will not be impressed if they are not affected by it, nor will they change anything for the better and continue in the old style, so that only the peoples remain the sufferers, who only make fists in their pockets grim and senseless. And as is the case with the majority of humanity on earth, this is done without resistance, whereby the killing and murdering fighters then also quickly break through their inner oppressed instincts, and consequently the bloodshed and murders break through in a hellish way as passion, and murderous blood orgies and massacres are organized on the alleged enemies, and women and girls are also raped. The undisguised fact is that in the majority of the people of the earth an urge, an arousal and impulsiveness of violence, revenge, retaliation and the desire to kill smolder, which always degenerate when the opportunity arises, whereby even a small and controlled thought emotional movement can be reason enough. On the outside it is other things that trigger things like alcohol, and order, drugs, jealousy, enmity, money, possessions and property, an unkind word, wealth, religious belief, other religious delusions, music, hatred, envy, greed, sports enthusiasm, quarrels, bad mood and much more. Instead of putting one's thoughts, feelings and behavior on a religious faith, any bondage or enthusiasm, and hanging on to them senselessly and purposelessly, for which often a lot of money has to be paid, such as taxes for religions and sects, contributions for football clubs and other sports organizations, etc., the development of clear mind, effective reason and intelligence would be of paramount importance. Only the evaluative formation and development of one's own personality, character, consciousness, the correct attitude to life and lifestyle, true humanity and the effective humanity appropriate to creation, as well as the clear, good, correct and correct behaviors in every relationship must stand in the first place of the self-development of man. However, by a religious or other faith, bondage or enthusiasm for a sport, etc., nothing is achieved in relation to true righteousness and true humanity. And this is also in the sense that when a person indulges only in his delusion, his bondage or his spirit, his personal development in terms of personal initiative and complete independence completely falls by the wayside. Thus no own will can come off, in order to let come up personally a good idea, energy and strength, and to create something useful and valuable from an own direction constantly. Religious faith, religious, political, military, state or any other bondage, but also enthusiasm for sports or any other things, occupy people up to fanaticism and prevent them from doing even the smallest thoughts and ideas for their development regarding their knowledge, their wisdom and education, as well as their personality, character, righteous behavior and a real and valuable expansion of consciousness. Now that everything is as I say it is, not only are people's minds, reason and intelligence being excessively impaired, especially by people's religious beliefs, but also especially by the enthusiasm and fanaticism of sports enthusiasts, such as explicit football, etc., and all kinds of other things, but also their self-development, which is often completely stifled in every respect. But men affected by these factors are neither able to perceive nor to understand, let alone to comprehend, because evenly mind, reason and intelligence through malicious and lying suggestive whispers pathologically of the stupidity of addicts of faith, and through the impairment of mind, reason and intelligence of believers, boned wit and enthusiasts, no clear thought can be grasped, and neither the real reality nor their truth can be recognized and understood. So it is therefore absolutely not in my sense and speeches to degrade neither the unstable, servile, enthusiastic nor those who believe in religion as human beings, Even if I harshly damage, strain, damage, tear and sharply criticize their addiction, enthusiasm or religious delusion, and their impairment of intellect, reason and intelligence. But what can be said further about all that has been said and revealed relates to the fact that everything is getting worse in every respect, because more and more people are populating the world and the overpopulation, and thus also the mass of the majority of religious sectarian delusionists is being pushed up ever higher in a blatant way. Through this further growing majority of mankind, the religious craze for faith continues to grow in relation to the increase of the worldwide overpopulation, whereby firstly, the possibility of man to learn and integrate himself into the creative natural laws is suppressed and made to disappear just as drastically as the becoming independent, the free self-thinking, free self-decisions and the carrying and exercising of personal responsibility. And secondly, the rapid development of technology, particularly through devices such as apps, television, radio and the internet, and thus through the long-standing transmission of information, which no longer has anything to do with communication, is also learning less and less. Thus also all more and more negative forms of not more learning with regard to self-thinking and self-decisions in the context of self-determination and personal freedom fall away, because the majority of mankind on Earth is dominated by the greed for constantly new technical achievements and their possession and use. But this also means that the sense of real love and righteousness, the values of life, peace, freedom and justice, as well as the true values of life, true humanity and compassion, etc. are dwindling and even getting completely lost. Also the perception, care and understanding of the real creative natural reality and its truth have already sunk so deeply that it is no longer understood what is to be understood by it at all. Interpersonal relations have already reached such a low point that due to the long since impersonal and pathological use of app information technology, a miserable lack of communication and thus also a roaring indifference towards one another has developed among the majority of the Earth's humanity, spreads itself further and ultimately leads to the family members themselves becoming strangers hated among themselves. Basically, I want to say that the earthly humanity is absolutely and completely overtaxed with the progress of the whole technology and its handling in every respect, and therefore cannot deal with it, especially with electronics technology. This is used absolutely idiotically by the earthlings and underage toddlers, just as with regard to the app information transfer, whereby communication between people and interpersonal relationships are increasingly destroyed and indifference in every respect becomes more and more catastrophic. Also, the surveillance mania caused by grid findings etc. has already become a problem that leads to total personality transparency and thus to the so-called transparent person. In many areas, the surveillance mania has already become a pathological delusion, and it cannot be stopped and ultimately leads to people being spied on by the state authorities, criminals, the military, secret services, security services, and any other elements. In the end, all freedom and even the personal sphere of the people are controlled and monitored down to the most intimate areas, which then effectively turns scenarios of this kind, as they appear in science fiction films, into reality. And when I have said everything in this way, then of course I am attacked, insulted and condemned by all those stupid fools who deny the whole of all my statements and explanations, because they are not accessible to the truth, and moreover absolutely incapable of understanding, rational and intelligent thinking and knowing the truth, and they vegetate in an evil-smelling, pathological megalomania of their primitive and consciously retarded desire to know better.
Which you'll be proved right. However, as you said earlier, your remarks correspond to a long monologue, but it explains absolutely everything correctly and justifiably and reveals the facts as they actually are. But you always surprise me with your choice of words, your formulations and precise explanations. And that you call everything by its proper name, Despite the disgusting lies and slander against you by various religious leaders, religious believers and know-it-alls, antagonists and other enemies, as well as by your ex-wife and the younger of your sons, that requires from you a heavenliness that is missing from all those who insult you by lies and slander of deceit and deception, and will never become their own. The unfortunate hatred and the unfounded accusations directed against you, as well as the scurrilous and disparaging defamations and pretending false facts and insults are so vulgar and vulgar that with it the temptations raised against you to every man gifted with understanding and reason, accusations and insinuations as well as the malicious and vile attitude of those attacking you must become absolutely clear. Consequently only unstable, gullible people can fall for such incriminations. Consider them possible and fall for them by faith.
Thank you. But your father Sfath taught me how to explain in detail and to name the facts correctly, as well as the use of necessary strong terms and words and so on. But as for the antagonists who are struggling and living in delusion, me and my work in their hatred, their jealousy and envy, in their primitive revenge and stupid revenge, unjustified and for whatever reason, or as a result of their delusion, I am not interested in having to roll down and finish them. So I don't care either, but continue my work in peace, because as a rational and responsible person you have to fight for the good, the right and for the real truth, otherwise evil and degenerate, lies and slander, hatred, revenge and retribution prevail. And if we do not fight for a good, right and real truth, then the powerless, insecure and intimidated, who are weaker than the unscrupulous wrongdoers, who in their stupid stupidity are wicked, morally perverse and irresponsible liars and slanderers, will be defeated. However, when the antagonists publicly reveal themselves and their antagonism, hatred and imbalance or consciousness disability in their persistent state of far underdeveloped cognitive abilities, then they only harm themselves. And they also do this when, in the state of their unusually primitive exuberant consciousness, restrictions regarding their affective behavior, their self-abasement and their behavior poor in understanding and reason, they embarrass themselves in the face of their fellow men and the world itself, making them impossible and ridiculous, because they achieve exactly the opposite of what they actually want, as a result of which they ultimately get angry and rot over their failures. Then this is solely their business. Unfortunately, these people do not learn anything, and as a result they do not gain any experience from everything they experience, because through the years they live through they do not become wise, but only older and stupider. But what I have now expressed in a different way in relation to a corresponding reader reaction in the June Zeitzeichen number 95, whereby, as you can read here, I have written the following in response to a corresponding question, as I have already told and shown you recently. I want to mention this again in our official conversation here now, because you have raised this topic again yourself.